From Nashville, Tennessee, Music City, USA, and the home of hot chicken, it's the Rick Altizer Show. Sit back, buckle up. Rick will talk with the movers, shakers, and creators who put Christ in Christian entertainment. He's a man who's clear so the world can hear. Here's Rick Altizer.
Welcome to the show today. Today, my guest is C.S. Lewis. Well, actually, it's not C.S. Lewis. It is actor David Payne. David, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
David Payne is an actor from Rising Image Productions. He also writes the plays. He tours the country as C.S. Lewis. And as a matter of fact, he's going to be in town in Nashville from November 16th through the 27th. Gosh, David, that's a lot of dates.
Yes, it's what we call our Lewis Tolkien Festival, and the first set of performances are an evening with C.S. Lewis. The second set of performances is called Wardrobes and Rings, and it focuses on a meeting between C.S. Lewis and his great friend J.R.R. Tolkien.
So an evening with C.S. Lewis is from November 16th through the 20th. And Wardrobes and Rings, the production about C.S. Lewis and his friend Tolkien, is November 23rd through 27th. It's at the Luby Theater in Nashville.
Yes, the Luby Theater, downtown Nashville. I think that's on Rosa Parks Boulevard.
And we're just kind of getting all this out of the way right at the top. We're just getting the plug in now. But for those who are interested in getting tickets, and finding more information, you can go to risingimage.com. So it's not an image that's stable or just flat. It's not a falling image. It's a rising image.
.com.
What brought Rising Image?
Well, the history is that Lewis, when he was asked about the Narnia Chronicles in particular, why he wrote them, he used the term that images would rise in his mind. So an image of a fawn or an umbrella, a queen on a sledge, a magnificent lion, and those images would rise up in his mind. And I thought, oh, right. Well, I'll call my production Rising Image Productions. It's actually Rising Image LLC now, but I call it Rising Image because pretty well all my productions are C.S. Lewis related.
Well, you can get more info about David and his productions and about the particular Lewis Tolkien Festival at risingimage.com, or you can call 615-788-6151. So we've got the plug out of the way, David. And so I'm really interested in this story. Let's talk about, first off, you're not from around these here parts.
No, I'm not from Tennessee, though I do live 8 months of the year in Tennessee. That's when I'm not touring. And actually Nashville is where I actually first started acting a long time ago, can you believe? But originally I'm from London, England. And
you were in the music industry before you became an actor, is that right?
Yeah, I was in Christian music industry in England, and came to Nashville in 92 because a British company wanted to set up a division in Nashville, and I had done a lot of consultancy work for them. And so they asked me whether I would be willing to come over and set it up for them. And I was supposed to be here for 2 years. So my wife and I came over with our younger son, Daniel, and actually we ended up staying nearly 18 years. And about 2 or 3 years into that timing, I came across a bulletin from a theatrical company that did their productions at TPAC. And it said, there was a display ad. And
that's the Tennessee Performing Arts Center.
Tennessee Performing Arts Center in downtown Nashville. And it said, the display ad said, auditions for Shadowlands. And Shadowlands is the play, and also it was a movie about C.S. Lewis and his American wife, Joy Gresham. Anyway, it said, auditions for Shadowlands, British accents, so help. And I thought, well, I've got a British accent. So I phoned up the telephone number, and a lady answered. She I found out later she was the director, and I said, look, I've got a British accent, but I've never been on stage before. Is there any point in me coming down? And she said, well, yes, come down. It's community theatre. We welcome all comers. And it was that night. So I thought, well, I'll go down then. And I did. I hoped I might get a small part, a speaking part. No point in having a walk-on part with a British accent. So I hoped I might get a small speaking part, and actually ended up with the lead role of C.S. Lewis. And that's where it all started. I think it was 1996.
96. You did your first role as C.S. Lewis, and then were you well-versed in C.S. Lewis prior to that?
Not really. I'd first come across C.S. Lewis when I was 17 years old, and I was given a copy of the Screwtape Letters. And then I read other books from him that he'd written, in the intervening years, Mere Christianity, some of the Narnia Chronicles. But of course, playing Lewis gave me an incentive to really do some study, and so read a lot more of his books and read lots of stuff about him, biographies. And a lot of it was in preparation for the play. I wanted to find the man. And during the play, or during the rehearsals, the director gave me a copy of A Grief Observed, which is the book he wrote after his wife died. And that gave me a really great insight into Lewis in many ways, even though it was focused on his grief. And for some reason, after Shadowlands play was over, for some reason I memorized the book. It was only 96 pages, so it wasn't too bad. And then that eventually turned into a one-man performance, which was called Mist in the Morning, Mourning, and performed that in Nashville, actually, and then in various parts of America. After I'd performed it, I used to meet the audience afterwards, and people used to come and ask me questions about Lewis, wanted to know about his friendship with Tolkien, more about his wife. And I thought, I think it would be interesting if there was a play where Lewis himself could deal with these sort of questions that people ask. And so I wrote An Evening with C.S. Lewis, and that is set in his home, and he's being visited by a group of American writers, and they've come to hear him give a sort of potted history of his life. And because he was a man with a great sense of humor, there's a lot of humor in the play, so people will probably laugh more than they think they're going to laugh when they come along to a play like this. And he talks about his childhood. He's obviously talks about his great friend Tolkien, talks about his brother, well, that was a wonderful relationship, talks about how he went from atheism to Christianity. And then the second half of the play is when he talks about his wife, and there's quite a bit of humour in that because of the way they met. But there's also, it's a great romance story anyway, but there's also pathos in it because she died 3 years after he married her with bone cancer, and he talks a little bit of how he coped with her grief. And that's An Evening with C.S. Lewis. I'm
speaking with actor and author. You're a screenwriter.
Indeed.
Who portrays C.S. Lewis, has been doing that for 20 years now. David Payne is with me. And so 20 years ago, you started this journey into C.S. Lewis, and you've begun to study him. And now, would you consider yourself a C.S. Lewis expert?
I consider myself one who probably knows more about C.S. Lewis than most people know, but I'm not a C.S. Lewis scholar in the sense that I can reel off all sorts of information about his books. If you want a C.S. Lewis scholar, go to a C.S. Lewis scholar. But I'm pretty well versed in C.S. Lewis, and we worked out the other day that we have now done in this country and in the UK over 700 performances of an evening with C.S. Lewis. So during that time, I just keep picking up things about Lewis, and it's really interesting.
Now, you've written, and it's so amazing that you go and audition for a role 20 years ago. You get the lead role in a major production in Nashville, and from there, a career is spawned, and you go all over the world, really. You're all over the U.S., you're all over the U.K., portraying C.S. Lewis in these multiple productions that you put together. Let's talk a little about the different ones. I know that I've seen the Screw Tape Letters. There was a
Ours is
musical
called Target Practice.
Target Practice, which is a musical based on Screw Tape Letters. I saw Saint Jack and the Dragon.
Yes, that's Lewis had two. There were two women in Lewis's life that had an enormous impact. Well, three women actually. His mother, she died when he was 9 years old. Obviously, his wife Joy Gresham, which was the sort of theme of Shadowlands and so involved in my play, and even with C.S. Lewis. But in the intervening years between his mother dying and meeting Joy Gresham, he ended up with an adopted mother. And the story about that is quite fascinating in that he had a friend who he trained with in the army in the First World War. And when that friend went away, and this was after 6 weeks training, when they went to the frontline trenches in France, they went to different places as it happens, his friends said to him, "Would you look after my mother and my sister if I die?" Lewis had met them, so he knew who they were. He'd spent a couple of weekends at their home. And Lewis said yes. And the friend's name was Paddy. Paddy did die, and Lewis honoured his promise. And so he looked after and cared for this woman and her daughter. The husband had walked out years ago. And it's a really intriguing story because as she got older, she got really very difficult to live with. She was a bit of a drag, and that's why it's called St. Jack, because Lewis's nickname was Jack. Everybody knew him as Jack. And her name was Mrs. Moore, and she was a bit of a drag, and then she got more and more unreasonable as she got older. A lot of people didn't like her. Warney, Lewis's brother, couldn't stand her, and very few people liked her. And to me, it's if you look at Joy and Jack, Joy Gresham and Jack, his wife, and him, to me that story is about romance. Of course, it's about so many aspects of love, but also it's got eros love in it. If you look at the Joy, at the Lewis and his adopted mother, Mrs. Moore, that's more agape love, because he was just so kind to her. And even when she got to the point where she was so unreasonable, Lewis was faithful to his promise, and didn't just bear it. Was happily willing to meet his commitment, and he did until she died in a nursing home in Oxford when she was in her 70s. It's just a wonderful story. But of course, so I wanted to write St. Jack and the Dragon. She's the dragon, St. Jack is the saint. And I wanted to write that, and so I had Warney in the play. I introduced an American maid. We don't know. She was always going through maids. She went through maids like we go through hot dinners. And of course, apart from it being a very touching story in many ways, of course, it's very humorous because conflict it provides so much humor. So that's St. Jack and the Dragon. And
I also saw you tour The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yeah, we actually finished a full cast tour of that last year. And there's 12 people in the cast. I used to play Aslan on stage and wear a very heavy costume, but it got to the point where it was my body was saying, no, you need to give this one up. And so for our last production, we actually created a puppet lion built here in Nashville, can you believe, by a wonderful lady who does puppetry. And so Aslan on stage last year was a puppet. We had 2 operators inside the puppet, so it gives you some idea of the size of the puppet. And I did the voice of Aslan off stage, so I was very happy to do that. And it was great fun. I loved it. I got weary of the role of Aslan because of the costuming and whatever. But to have a puppet out there and me do the voice off stage was great.
Yeah, a cup of tea, sitting in your shorts.
Absolutely.
You know.
I didn't have to look good at all. All I was in there, I just had to sound good. Welcome, son of Adam. Welcome, Susan and Lucy, daughters of Eve. Welcome, he beaver and she beaver. But where is the other son of Adam?
Then sip a tea. Let them do all the heavy lifting, you know.
Then have a sip of tea.
Sip some tea. Let them do the heavy lifting. That's great. Love it. Awesome. So you've in all these productions, you also, during the midst of all this, doing all these C.S. Lewis productions, someone had hired you to do a audio Bible. Is that correct?
Yes, the Holman Christian Standard Bible. It was published quite a few years ago now. Can't remember how many years ago. So they came to me and said, would I do the audio version, which I did. Took me a year to do it. Then after, when they launched the whole Bible, they asked me if I would, it was part of the launch, they wanted to have some sort of drama. So they asked me if I would write something. And I had been very touched when I was recording the letters to Timothy. Paul's talking to Timothy, and as I was recording it, I could sense that he's passing on the baton, he's encouraging Timothy. There's almost a sense of pathos because he knows that he's coming to the end of his life, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if Timothy and Paul had been together and we could listen in to Paul talking the words to Timothy rather than writing the words to Timothy. And I thought, well, I'd like to write a play that takes a lot of the great quotes and things that Paul wrote to the churches, but I'd like him to be talking it to somebody. And so I introduced a servant girl who actually is a secret believer, and she is not very comfortable with Paul at the beginning because she thinks he's an imposter. Planted by the authorities to break down the church. But in the end, after a series of chats and events, she comes to accept that Paul is what he is. And then they talk. He talks to her about things he's written to the churches. And it's Paul out speaking the words rather than us reading them. So 1 Corinthians 13, the chapter on love, it's you get Paul speaking it rather than reading it. And it just is a different dimension. It doesn't change the truth. The truth is the truth. I actually think it gives us a sort of almost another way of celebrating the truth. And I've had grown men cry at the play because they've heard the scripture they know so well said in no, I don't mean in a dramatic sense, but in an ordinary sense, but said rather than written. Communicated.
And the name of that...
it's called Prisoner of Passion. Apostle Paul, Prisoner of Passion. And the reason I called it Prisoner of Passion, because he was a prisoner to his passion. You've only got to read the scriptures. You've only got to read the Pauline epistles to know that he had this incredible passion for Christ. He said, he talked about that my goal is to know him and the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of his sufferings, and be conformed to his death.
I'm with actor and playwright David Payne, who spends the last 20 years has been doing C.S. Lewis productions. And also, we just learned Paul, the Prisoner of Passion. So it's so interesting that 20 years ago, you do this thing, and it turns into this career for you. Talk a little bit about what it is now. What is your life like now? What are you doing now?
Oh, well, performances, or most of the time, I get less chance to write. I'd like to write a lot more than I do, but I get less chance because I'm touring so much. So any given year now, we're probably doing maybe 70-plus performances every year. We just finished this year a run at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh, Scotland, is probably the largest performing arts festival in the world. And we were there for 3 weeks. And there are so many productions there, and you better be good, otherwise you're just going to get submerged. If you're not any good, you're going to get 3 or 4 people turn up to see you, and it's all about the reviews. And they come and review it in the early days, and you either live or die by those reviews. And we were very fortunate; we got good reviews for both our plays, An Evening with C.S. Lewis and Wardrobes and Rings, and from that point on, they were sold out.
And so you're in a van, you're driving, you're traveling, you're going from location to location. You're doing theaters, you're doing churches, you're doing all kinds of different venues.
I've even done in England. I did this massive tent. It was a 1,000-seater tent, and it was An Evening with C.S. Lewis in the afternoon. Can you believe? An Evening with C.S. Lewis in the afternoon, a music festival. But they had this tent, a 1,000-seater tent, as part of their setup. And it was mostly all music groups in there. But they asked me to come along and perform An Evening with C.S. Lewis. And I thought, oh, well, this is going to be a disaster. So my set was lots of background was back guitars and things. But you know what? I had 1,000 people in there, and if it had been a solid floor, it was a grass floor, but if it had been a solid floor, you could have heard a pin drop. Wow,
that's amazing. Well, C.S. Lewis is so loved, and his writings have been so touching and moving, and especially in our culture now, as far as some of the apologetics from Mere Christianity. He was such a great thinker. What particular writings personally touch you that he's written?
Well, and obviously, Mere Christianity was quite important to me. Where he encourages people about Christian truth. A Grief Observed, of course, because I memorized it. So I think those 2 books of his novels. Probably my favorite was Till We Have Faces. It's a retelling of a Greek myth. And so those are my favorite books.
So can we do a part 2?
Indeed.
Okay, so next week is part 2. As we head out, would you give us some C.S. Lewis to kind of close us out?
All right, I'll try and do it. He's in The Grief Observed. After Joy has died, he's beginning to recover. He's very angry at first, then he's beginning to recover. And he says this one night, he said, "One moment last night can be described in similes. Otherwise it won't go into languages at all. Imagine a man in total darkness. He thinks he's in a cellar or dungeon, and then there comes a sound. He thinks it might be a sound from far off, waves, wind-blown trees, cattle half a mile away. And if so, it proves he's not in a cellar, but free in the open air. Or it might be a much smaller sound close at hand, like a chuckle of laughter. And if so, there's a friend just beside him in the dark. Either way, a good sound. Oh, I'm not mad enough to take such an experience as evidence for anything. It is simply the leaping into imaginative activity of an idea I'd always have theoretically admitted. The idea that I or any mortal at any time may be utterly mistaken as to the situation he or she is really in."
I know I kind of threw that at you, but I appreciate that. We're going to talk more about, I want to focus on the productions, An Evening with C.S. Lewis and Wardrobes and Rings. And you can see both of these productions here in Nashville at the Luby Theater, downtown Rosa Parks Boulevard. On November 16th through the 20th, you can see An Evening with C.S. Lewis featuring David Payne. And November 23rd through the 27th, Wardrobes and Rings. a story about C.S. Lewis. I'm getting you confused already. About C.S. Lewis and his relationship with J.R.R. Tolkien. Mm-hmm. And you can get more information on these shows and ticket information at risingimage.com. And you can also call 615-788-6151. And David, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
And looking forward to part 2. Come back next week and join us as we talk with David Payne here on The Rick Altizer Show. The music you are listening to is from my scripture memory record, and I want to give it to you for free. Just go to my website, rickaltizer.com, and click Contact. Altizer is spelled A-L-T-I-Z-E-R. Or how about liking my Facebook page, facebook.com/Rick Altizer Show. I want to thank Paul Winkler, the investor coach, for sponsoring this show, and I want to thank you for listening. So be sure to check us out again next week as we discuss how we communicate the gospel through media to our culture. Let's be clear so the world can hear. I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening.